welcome. I'm Mark Zibarabak, a political columnist for the Los Angeles Times, here to talk about California's gubernatorial recall election now in its home stretch. I'm joined by five of my fabulous LA Times colleagues. Before I introduce them, however, a bit of perspective. In the whole history of these United States, there have been 4 gubernatorial recall elections. As it happens, 2 of them have taken place here in California within the last 20 years. Now, polls suggest that our current governor, the Democrat Gavin Newsom, is more likely than not to beat the recall, but as the old cliche goes, polls don't vote, people do. We're not going to try and make any predictions, but what we can do is talk about how we got to this point and where California is likely to go, whatever happens on Tuesday. And with that, let me introduce you to our panelists, starting with columnist Erica Smith. Erica covers California with a particular emphasis on the diversity of people and places that make this state the rich tapestry that we all know and love. In Sacramento, Taryn Luna, Phil Willon, they cover Gavin Newsom and have been covering this recall from the get-go. And lastly, from our illustrious Metro staff, we have Faith Pinu and Julia Wick. They have been traveling hither and yon all over the campaign trail, covering the action, the rough, the tumble. I'm going to start with you, Phil. It's your lucky day. We don't have to go back that far. November 2018, Gavin Newsom elected in a landslide. Stomps, wallops, whoops. The Republican John Cox, who happens to be one of those running again to replace him. How did we get from there to this point, Phil?
Well, it's been a long, crazy, wild ride. I mean, since almost the day Gavin Newsom stepped into office, attempts have been launched to try to recall him from office. So basically, I think this one is now the 6th. And I guess the most effective, obviously. But when this began, which was in the early 2020, it was an afterthought. It was something like a faint honk in the night, barely noticeable. No one really thought it had a chance. So anyway, the recall drive just kind of languished for months. They were gathering signatures as best they could, and lo and behold, the pandemic hit, and that did a couple things. One is that it gave them another issue to kind of build on. The pandemic and the COVID response wasn't even part of the initial recall petition. But as Californians got more, I guess, started to chafe a little bit more about all the restrictions, about the stay-at-home orders, about their kids not being in school, more animosity started to build among the electorate. And it wasn't really just Republicans or Trump supporters. It was a kind of more the California electorate, some Democrats, moderates. And then in November, a year ago almost, a judge in Sacramento, because of all the restrictions imposed by the pandemic, including stay-at-home orders, gave the petition, the recall proponents, 4 or 5 more months to gather signatures. That put them over the edge. It qualified in April, and here we are.
I want to turn to Faith and ask you, Phil touched on this, and you certainly hear Gavin Newsom and his allies, they keep talking about the Republican recall. This is an attempt by Republicans to steal away an office they couldn't win under normal circumstances. So what's animating? Who's behind this recall? And is there anything to that assertion that this is a Republican power grab, quote unquote?
There is certainly a concentrated number of Republicans who are excited about this recall, and they might be the people who put this over the edge. But the recall effort was really started by these 3 political novices. They're Orrin Heatley, who is a former sheriff sergeant, Mike Netter, who is a realtor, and Randy Economy, who was at one point a journalist. And they started this effort. They are Republicans, but they crisscrossed the state gathering support for this. And as Phil said, a lot of people were upset about how the pandemic was run by the state administration, and they took out their anger on Newsom. And that runs the gamut from the most conservative Republicans in the northeastern corner of the state, where like President Trump got the most support, to Democrats in Los Angeles. So there were people really from across the spectrum supporting this. Of course, Gavin Newsom and his campaign are trying to paint everyone as Trump Republicans, which is certainly true for a section of the electorate, but there are people from all stripes supporting this effort.
Taryn, we've gotten this far without really discussing the pandemic, and COVID, I think we'd agree, overshadows everything. So how has this pandemic, how has some of the actions Gavin Newsom has taken, has not taken, has angered people by taking, how has COVID and the pandemic played into all this?
I mean, I think we all saw last spring when he did the stay-at-home orders. I think by May, we had massive protests in places like Orange County and a lot of pushback on that throughout the pandemic. But, now in hindsight, looking back, he polls pretty well in terms of how he handled it, particularly among Democrats. And I think another interesting thing to note is his approval ratings have also remained pretty high throughout this, above 50%. Before the French Laundry situation, he was higher at like 64%, and they dropped. But even throughout this, whether, going through a pandemic, ordering people to stay home, doing business restrictions, he's weathered that pretty well in terms of his popularity.
Mm-hmm. Erica, Phil talked about how a lot of the issues in this recall have been litigated. As you know, as a lot of our viewers probably know, California has a very long history of what I'll call grievance-driven politics. Some of this old, some of this new, but here we are.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily, I think we've all kind of mentioned that so much of the roots of this recall these aren't new issues. And I think it was Phil or Taryn talked about and Faith talked about some of the issues out of the far north. I mean, one of those I would add to that is forest management, which we've seen a lot lately with the Dixie fire and the Caldor fire, and people being very upset about, with Democrats. But I think it also just goes to this broader idea that there's a lot of more conservative leading voters in the state that feel that the Democratic majority has basically not only just neglected their interests, but actively is trying to ruin their way of life, I guess, whatever, quote unquote. So I think that there's just a lot of anger that's out there. And I think that it's behind that. And I do agree that the pandemic just gave people a venue for that. And it, all of these other grievances kind of got, sucked all the air out of the room with COVID. It became about mask mandates and vaccine mandates and, businesses being closed. And that became the big driver. But of course, the irony is that now most of the electorate is actually kind of approving of the way that Governor Newsom has handled most of this, even if they're not exactly thrilled the way everything went down. I think that we can look today at the rates of vaccination and the rates of hospitalization in here in California, compare it to Texas or compare it to Florida, where governors there are still, kind of walking the talk that a lot of the recall supporters would have us do. And you see that's happening there. So it is kind of this very interesting mixture of kind of like pick your grievance. And that's why I want to recall Gavin Newsom.
Yeah. Julia Toofer, if I may, you pick up your ballot. Everyone in California was mailed one. Every voter in California was mailed one. 46 names on the ballot. Talk about that. And then notably, no top shelf, well-known Democrat running. In contrast to 2003, the Lieutenant Governor Cruz Bustamante ran on the no on the recall, but yes on Bustamante. We don't have that dynamic this time. So talk a bit about the absence of a big name Democrat and some of the other folks on the ballot.
Absolutely. So I'll start with the second part of your question, which is why there isn't any well-known Democrat on your ballot. That was considered a real victory for the Newsom camp that no prominent Democrat got into the race. Their kind of thinking, they really discouraged anyone from getting in, was that if there was a prominent Democrat on that list, it would legitimize the recall effort, but also there are, voters who might be willing to vote yes on recall who wouldn't otherwise be willing to do so if there was a candidate they liked on that list. So there are 6 Democrats running. The most well-known is Kevin Pathrath, I think 28 or 29-year-old YouTuber who has no elected office experience. And there really isn't anyone who most Democrats consider to be a viable candidate.
And worth noting, last time we had 135 candidates, this time 46. And any speculation from anyone on why we didn't hit that number this time around?
Yeah.
Less interest?
2 things I've heard. One is that tax returns were required. Those then actually ended up not being required after the filing deadline due to a lawsuit, but they were when people filed. And so experts say that probably discouraged some people. And it was also a much shorter turnaround time that people had to really go and get. You need something like 65 to 100 and something signatures, and far more if you want to get a discount on your filing fee.
Got it. Okay, so we're on 135, but still more flavors than Baskin Robbins, 46. Let's hit the campaign trail. Taryn, talk about Gavin Newsom, how his messaging, as the pros say. How has his messaging evolved over the course of this recall campaign?
Well, back in January, you saw the Democratic Party come out and try to label the recall as the California coup. It happened a week after the insurrection attempt in Washington, and that messaging wasn't all that well received at the time. So they kind of moved away from the coup wording, but the idea that this was a Republican recall stuck. And they continued to brand it as such throughout the pandemic. There was a moment, I think it was in May through June, where Newsom tried some positive messaging, where they started talking about all the things he did in his budget. California had a massive budget this year, and they were able to do quite a lot. So he started promoting the positive there. At the time, it looked like California was going to be reopening, turning a corner away from the pandemic, and that might be in the rearview mirror by the time of the election. Then the Delta variant came back, and they dropped the positive messaging. They kind of had a lull at the moment. It was one of the times when Newsom's polling was kind of lower than it had been. It was showing kind of a 50-50 split in July. And then Larry Elder walked onto the scene. So they not only were able to continue with their messaging that this was a Republican recall, but they suddenly had a boogeyman, so to speak, in the room, and someone who could actually validate their argument that you could have someone like Trump, or as bad as Trump in their mind, and how they wanted to cast him to voters as governor if Newsom wasn't kept.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Julia, let's talk about Larry Elder. There are a whole bunch of Republicans running, including the former San Diego mayor, Kevin Faulconer, Assemblyman Kevin Kiley, but polls suggest that the front runner is the quote unquote sage of South Central, Larry Elder, talk radio host. What's his messaging been on the campaign trail? And as I mentioned, longtime talk radio host, has written a lot of books. There's a long, what's known as a paper trail. So what's he been saying on the campaign trail, and what's in that paper trail?
Absolutely. I've been to maybe 5 or 6 Elder events this week, and his messaging is very consistent. It's basically everything Newsom is doing in the state isn't working. He hits Newsom on schools, crime, pandemic closures. He hits Newsom very hard on the French Laundry incident, and kind of the idea that he feels like Newsom set these rules and then wasn't necessarily following it. Those are kind of the big things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Erica, you wrote a column that was quite provocative. I know I got an earful. I know you got an earful. Talk a bit about that column and your perspective on Larry Elder.
Yeah, I apologize for everybody's inboxes and social media feeds for that one. That's my bad. And also, Taryn, I want to commend you I forgot all about the California coup messaging. I don't know. It seems like that was like an eternity ago, but yes, actually, that did actually occur. So thank you for reminding me of that. But to answer your question, Mark, I think, his messaging has just been interesting. I feel like it's, he's one of those guys that he's obviously well known on the Fox News sphere, and everybody on the right, he's had a radio show forever, nationally syndicated. He's got a popular podcast and website, and he's constantly on Fox News, talking. And so there's a lot of people who know exactly who he is, particularly on the right. There's also another, group of people here in Southern California who either grew up listening to him or their parents listened to him on the radio. And I'm talking more people of color here, who kind of, who knew who he was. He's obviously from South Central, went to Crenshaw High School, as he's fond of saying on the campaign trail, and that also he's from the hood. And so that's also something that he says quite a bit on the campaign trail. But he's also this guy that, that has, really angered and irked a lot of the Black community here in Los Angeles and in Southern California, in part because he's gone out of his way to antagonize them. This is particularly people on the left. And, and so I think that there's also, this idea that he's been a lot of his stances on things, that systemic racism doesn't exist, that his hardline policies on immigration, though he's not talking as much about that right now, given the fact that he needs Latinos to vote for him. So he's kind of this interesting kind of character. And I think that's why, a lot of the rallies that he's holding, that Julia and Faith have been attending diligently, are in these areas that typically aren't where you find a lot of voters of color. He's going to Orange County. He's going to parts of Northern California where there's not much diversity. And so it's interesting. His electorate is not representative of him being what you would think of a typical Black candidate in California.
Yeah, I want to stick with you for a second, Eric. I'm old enough. I mean, no, I did not cover the 1921 Lynn Fraser recall, but I did cover the 1982 governor's race when former LA Mayor Tom Bradley was looking to make history, came very close. First Black governor in California history. A lot of excitement. Forgive the understatement. I don't hear a lot of excitement in the Black community like, hey, Larry Elder can make history.
No, there's not. I mean, it's kind of like, we want a Black governor, but not that guy is basically the gist of what I'm getting. I actually even had one lawmaker that tells me I want to have a Black governor, but I don't want to go back to Jim Crow to do it. So, I mean, I feel like it's if anything, I think probably the Black community, particularly those who hear the name Larry Elder, whether it's because they know exactly who he is because they've listened to his show and they're aware, or they're younger and their parents knew them, it's kind of like, oh, we need to get this guy out of here. Where did he come from? It's almost like it's almost a visceral reaction that I've noticed in talking to people within the Black community and in parts of the Latino community as well. But I mean, it is a very much of a like, we don't want this guy in office. And so it'll be interesting to see what the turnout will be among Black voters in LA and in other parts of the state, because I know he is doing some advertising in addition to areas of the far north and in parts of Central Valley. He's targeted some advertising. We had reported I guess earlier this month about how he's targeting some advertising in the parts of South Central LA and parts of the Bay Area that still have large Black communities in hopes of getting some voters. So we'll see.
Phil, there's a new LA Times poll out in partnership with UC Berkeley. It shows what a lot of polls have been showing, but you tell us what that poll suggests.
Yeah, it really kind of showed the evolution over the past month or month and a half of the Newsom campaign, the anti-recall campaign. As Taryn mentioned before, I mean, back in late July, it was basically 50-50. California voters were split 50-50 on whether to support the recall or not. And that was largely due to kind of Democratic indifference. They weren't really paying attention to the recall. I mean, didn't know why they had to engage in it. And over the past month, obviously, the Newsom campaign has flooded the airways and social media with ads, basically, espousing all the evils of Larry Elder and the Republicans trying to take his place. And it looks like that worked. It was pretty effective. So right now, about 60% of likely voters in the state are against the recall, and about 39 are in favor of it. And again, that was like a 10 percentage point swing just in the past month and a half or so. So it just kind of shows you that campaigns work.
Let's pretend we've got Governor Larry Elder. He's in office. It's day one. What could he get accomplished?
He could do a lot of things, actually. It's surprising. The first thing he could do is rescind a lot of the executive orders that were issued by Governor Newsom. Remember when Governor Newsom took office, he enacted a moratorium on the death penalty. He dismantled the death chamber at San Quentin. Larry Elder could basically take that away. We could reimpose the death penalty and start executing people. That's number one. Number two, Newsom issued an executive order to ban fracking. Larry Elder could not only rescind that, he could appoint, the CEO of Exxon to head the Department of Natural Resources if he wanted to. I mean, he has the authority to appoint all the department heads, and they don't even. I mean, most of the appointments, I think they have a year to be confirmed by the Senate. So someone could be on that position for over a year before the legislature could remove them or not confirm them.
Okay, Taryn, we're going to time travel. It is the day after the recall. Gavin Newsom has beat the recall. How does that set him up for 2022? Lest we forget, we have the gubernatorial election coming not that far around the corner. So where does this leave newly victorious Governor Gavin Newsom?
I think it's a little early to answer that question, probably the way that I'd want to be able to answer it. But I think it depends on kind of the margin of victory, right? So if it's a smaller margin, he might be slightly wounded, but he remains governor and he can continue on. If he wins by a landslide, I think that's a little bit different, and I think you would start to have questions about whether he would be primaried. And again, if he wins by a landslide, there's not going to be a lot of places for another Democrat to go if they do want to come in and try to run in the re-election.
Faith, I want to ask you, here in California, we have a senior, I mean that in terms of order of election, 88-year-old Democratic senator by the name of Dianne Feinstein. We certainly don't wish any ill upon her, but if her seat were to come open, whoever's governor would have the opportunity to appoint her replacement. How does that play out, and how has that theoretical instance played into the recall?
I think that's been kind of a subtle thorn in Democrats' side ahead of this election. It's certainly a concern for Democrats across the country who are watching the California recall election, because whoever is governor next, should Senator Feinstein's seat come up if she were to retire or something, whoever is governor gets to appoint her replacement. And nationally, Congress is neck and neck with senators. So if there were a Republican governor, such as Larry Elder, he could appoint a Republican senator and then disrupt the balance that is currently in the Senate. So that is certainly something that Democrats across the country, and Republicans, of course, but Democrats right now have the majority in the Senate. They're really concerned about that possibility. If Governor Newsom is governor, of course, he would appoint a Democratic senator should that seat come up.
Julia, we have not forgotten about you. Last, certainly not least. So Gavin Newsom he beats the recall. He does it by a lot. He does it by a little. In either case, what are the chances? I would surmise it's tough to see a Republican winning election in 2022. Again, no predictions, but what's the prospects of a Democrat stepping up and saying, hey, there's blood in the water. I'm going to take on Gavin.
I mean, Taryn touched on some of that, but I think that if it's close, it would be really surprising if we don't see some Democrats getting into the race. I think the question will be, at what level of prominence are they willing to challenge the party? But I think it really will depend on them saying that he defeats the recall, the margin by which he wins. And in terms of Republican candidates, to my knowledge, pretty much everyone has made it seem like they will run in 2022. Elder had kind of a funny response the other day after he voted. He really told off a reporter who had asked if he was planning to run in 2022 if he loses, saying, that's a purely academic question because I'm obviously winning, and so I'll be running for re-election, and kind of how dare you frame it like that?
There have to be some only in California moments. You've been out on the campaign trail. I mean, it's very serious, but it's not all terribly serious. So if any one of you have a particular only in California moment that stands out from covering this recall, what is it? Julia?
I just wrote a story on some of the lesser known candidates in the race, one of whom described the group as the off-Broadway candidates. And there were some very fun only in California details in there. One of the candidates, a yoga teacher from Marin, began her campaign on the steps of the Capitol, praying to the spirits of California, asking for kind of permission to enter the building as its leader. I spent some time with the Green Party candidate, Dan Kapelovitz, driving around, and he has a decommissioned police cruiser that we took down Melrose and Larchmont with him, like on the speaker saying, Dan Kapelovitz for governor, Dan Kapelovitz for governor, can you dig it? And then the kind of most LA part is you just are like looking out on the street and there's a lot of people outside eating and people just barely look up.
Anyone else playing into our much derided California wacky stereotype?
I had the pleasure of covering John Cox's press conference in the spring where he brought in Tag the Bear, a 1,000-pound Kodiak bear from, I think, either Santa Clarita or Ventura, so kind of a Republican bear, maybe, I don't know. But
a local bear.
Yeah, and they were feeding the bear chicken as John Cox stood up in front of the media and started talking about homelessness and crime and all, whatever. And I mean, all eyes were watching the bear, I guess, eat chicken, I guess, and this trainer throw it up in the air. It's like no one heard a peep he said.
One moment that stuck out to me from early on in the campaign trail was when Caitlyn Jenner had her first, I believe, major interview, and it was with Fox News' Sean Hannity. He had asked her a question about homelessness, and they were conducting this interview, it is worth to mention, inside her airplane hangar, her personal airplane hangar. And she was talking about how she was talking to a neighbor across the street in his airplane hangar about how he can't walk down the street because of all the homeless people. And I think that juxtaposition of here you have, you know, a former Olympic athlete, a former reality TV star, a quintessential California celebrity sitting in her airplane hangar talking about homelessness. It just can't get much more California than that.
Yeah, I think the pros call that bad optics. Erica, you had something?
Yeah, the bad optics. I just can't think of the other day when Larry Elder, you know, the guy who grew up in South Central, shows up in Venice for a tour of homeless encampments in an impeccable suit and gets harassed and chased out of Venice, which is one of the most expensive neighborhoods in LA, by activists and homeless people throwing eggs at him on the way out the door, which I think says everything that you need to know about Larry Elder standing with, you know, the working class folks of California.
And Taryn, your only in California moment from this recall campaign?
This is something one of my coworkers covered, Melody Gutierrez, but she was at a debate and actually managed to catch on camera a moment in which John Cox was served with a lawsuit while he was on stage speaking at a debate, and it was related to money he hadn't paid prior campaigns.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have. I want to thank my panelists, my colleagues for joining us, and thanks all of you for tuning in for this California Politics Recall 2021 special roundtable. If you haven't voted yet, there's still time. Mail it in, drop it off, do it in person, but vote, make sure your voice is heard. Thanks again for joining us.